Hello there, and welcome to Earth's history, where the past reaches across billions of years to touch the present, where every living thing is connected by threads of ancestry, so ancient they stretch back to the very beginning of life itself. Tonight, we're traveling to meet someone extraordinary, someone who lived so long ago that the world was utterly unrecognizable, someone you've never met but to whom you owe everything. This is the story of LUCA, the Last Universal Common Ancestor, the single organism from which all life on Earth descends, the ancient relative that connects you to every bacterium, every plant, every animal, every living thing that has ever existed. If you've ever looked at a tree and wondered how you could possibly be related to it, if you've ever watched bacteria under a microscope and felt they were alien, completely foreign, you're about to discover something profound. You are related to that tree. You are related to those bacteria. You're related to the moss growing on rocks, to the fish swimming in the ocean, to the birds flying overhead, to the fungi decomposing fallen logs. All of us, every organism on this planet, share a common ancestor. And that ancestor, LUCA, lived roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, in a world so different from ours that it might as well be another planet. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable, settled, ready to journey back through time to the very roots of the tree of life. Maybe you're lying in bed as the night wraps around you. Maybe you're sitting quietly as the day fades. Maybe you're in that liminal space where consciousness softens and the boundaries between self and world begin to blur. If this journey into deep ancestry brings you peace, if it helps you feel connected to something larger, something ancient, something that unites all living things, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video, subscribe to the channel, or share it with someone else who finds comfort in knowing we're all family, all descendants of the same ancient beginning. So settle in. Let your breathing slow like the patient replication of ancient cells. Let your thoughts drift like molecules in a primordial ocean. And let's begin. Because somewhere in the deep past, in warm water, lit by a young sun, in the chemical soup of early Earth, there lived an organism, not remarkable to look at. No eyes, no brain, no awareness, just a cell, or perhaps a community of cells, surviving, reproducing, passing on its genetic information. And from that humble beginning, from that single point in the tree of life, every living thing that followed would descend. You are here because LUCA was there. And tonight, we're going to meet them. Before we can meet LUCA, before we can understand what this ancient ancestor was like, we need to understand what we mean by common ancestor and why scientists believe such an organism existed. This requires us to think about the tree of life, not as a metaphor, but as a real structure, a branching pattern that describes how all organisms are related through descent. Imagine a family tree, like the ones people create to trace their genealogy. You're at the bottom, the present. Above, you are your parents. Above them, your grandparents. Above them, your great-grandparent. The tree branches backward through time, each generation connecting to the one before. Each individual having ancestors, those ancestors having their own ancestors, and so on, stretching back through history. Now imagine expanding that tree to include not just your family, but all human. At some point in the past, perhaps 300,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens first appeared, all the branches converge on a population of early human, our species' ancestor. Go back further, and you find common ancestor with Neanderthals, with other hominin, with early primates. Keep going back, and you find common ancestors with all mammals, with all vertebrate, with all animal, with all life. This is the tree of life, and it has a root, a point where all the branches come together, a moment in time when there was a single organism or population of organisms from which everything else descended. That organism is LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. Not the first life, not the origin of life itself, but the most recent ancestor that all current life shared. This is an important distinction. LUCA was not the first living thing. There were almost certainly many organisms before LUCA, many experiments in life, many lineages that arose and then went extinct, leaving no descendant. Early life was probably diverse, a community of different organisms trying out different strategies, different metabolism, different ways of surviving and reproducing. But of all those early organisms, only one lineage survived to the present, or at least only one lineage gave rise to all the life we see today. And the most recent organism in that surviving lineage that is ancestral to everything alive now is LUCA. We know LUCA existed because of the unity of life, despite the incredible diversity of living things, from bacteria to blue whales, from archaea to oak trees, all life shares certain fundamental features. All life uses DNA to store genetic information, or in some viruses, RNA. But the genetic code, the way DNA is translated into protein, is essentially universal. All life uses the same 20 amino acids to build protein. All life uses ATP as an energy currency. All life has cell membranes made of lipids. All life uses ribosomes to synthesize protein. This unity is not coincident. It's not the result of life arising multiple times and converging on the same solution. It's evidence of common ancestry, of all life descending from a single origin, from a single ancestral organism that already possessed these features. LUCA had DNA, had ribosomes, had cell membranes, had the basic machinery of life that we've all inherited. But how do we know what LUCA was like? We have no fossils of LUCA. At 3.5 to 4 billion years old, any physical remains would have been destroyed by geological processes, by the recycling of the Earth's crust, by heat and pressure and time. The rocks from that era are rare and highly altered. We can't dig up LUCA's bones because LUCA had no bones, was probably microscopic, and lived so long ago that the ground it lived on has long since been subducted into the mantle or eroded away. Instead, we reconstruct LUCA through genetics, through careful comparison of the DNA of living organisms, through phylogenetics, the science of evolutionary relationships. The logic is this: traits shared by all living things, or by the major branches of the tree of life, were likely present in LUCA. Traits found in only some lineages probably evolved after LUCA, after the tree of life began to branch. By comparing the genomes of bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, the three great domains of life, scientists can identify genes that are universal, or nearly so, genes that all organisms share, genes that must have been present in LUCA because they appear in all of LUCA's descendants. These genes, these molecular fossils, allow us to reconstruct what LUCA was like, what it could do, how it lived, even though we've never seen it, never found its remains, and never will. This reconstruction has been ongoing for decades, refining as we sequence more genomes, as we develop better methods for analyzing evolutionary relationships, as we discover new organisms that fill in gaps in our understanding. And from this work, a picture of LUCA has emerged, hazy in places, uncertain in details, but increasingly clear in broad strokes. LUCA was a single-celled organism, almost certainly. It was prokaryotic, meaning it lacked a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. It was small, probably no more than a few micrometers in diameter, invisible to the naked eye. It lived in water, almost certainly in the ocean, because the early Earth was largely covered by water, and terrestrial environments would have been hostile, bathed in ultraviolet radiation without an ozone layer to protect the surface. LUCA had a cell membrane, a boundary separating its interior from the environment. This membrane was probably made of lipids, fatty molecules that spontaneously form bilayers in water, creating a barrier that keeps the cell's contents inside while allowing selective exchange with the environment. The exact composition of LUCA's membrane is debated. Modern bacteria and archaea have different types of membrane lipid, suggesting that LUCA's membrane might have been simpler, perhaps a mix of different lipid types, or perhaps one type that later diverged into the specialized membranes we see today. Inside its membrane, LUCA had genetic material, DNA that stored the information needed to build and operate the cell. This DNA was organized into genes, sequences that coded for proteins or RNA molecules. LUCA had perhaps a few hundred to a few thousand genes, far fewer than most modern organisms, but enough to carry out the basic functions of life: metabolism, replication, response to the environment. LUCA had ribosomes, those molecular machines that read genetic information and synthesized proteins. Ribosomes are remarkably similar across all life, so similar that they must have been present in LUCA in essentially their modern form. They're made of ribosomal RNA and proteins, assembled into complex structures that facilitate the translation of genetic code into amino acid sequences. LUCA had metabolism, the chemical processes that extract energy from the environment and use it to power the cell. This is where things get interesting and controversial, because metabolism leaves fewer traces in the genome than structural features, and the metabolisms of different organisms have diverged significantly over billions of years. But by looking at what metabolic pathways are universal or nearly so, by looking at what environments could have supported early life, scientists have made inferences about LUCA's metabolism. Most evidence suggests that LUCA was a chemolithoautotroph, a term that sounds intimidating, but describes something elegant. Chemolitho-autotroph breaks down as chemo, deriving energy from chemical reaction. Litho, using inorganic compounds as electron donors. Autotroph, making its own organic molecules rather than consuming them from the environment. In simpler terms, LUCA probably lived off chemicals, used inorganic substances like hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide as fuel, and built its cellular structures from simple molecules like carbon dioxide. This metabolism is similar to what we find in microbes living around hydrothermal vents today, those underwater hot springs where mineral-rich water gushes from cracks in the ocean floor. These modern organisms survive in complete darkness, independent of sunlight, extracting energy from the chemical differences between the hot vent water and the cold ocean, using that energy to fix carbon and build biomass. Many scientists believe LUCA lived in a similar environment, perhaps around ancient hydrothermal vents, perhaps in other geochemically active settings where chemical energy was available. LUCA probably did not photosynthesize, did not use sunlight as an energy source. Photosynthesis is complex, requiring sophisticated molecular machinery, pigments that can capture light, electron transport chains that can convert light energy into chemical energy. This machinery differs significantly between bacteria and eukaryotes, suggesting that photosynthesis evolved independently in different lineages after LUCA, after the tree of life had already branched. LUCA reproduced, obviously, because if it hadn't, there would be no descendant, no tree of life, no us. But how it reproduced is less clear. Modern cells divide through complex processes like binary fission in bacteria or mitosis in eukaryotes, processes that require intricate molecular machinery. LUCA probably reproduced more simply, perhaps just by growing until it split, perhaps through budding, perhaps through some mechanism that no longer exists in any modern organism. LUCA probably had some form of gene transfer, some way of exchanging genetic material with other cells. This is inferred from the fact that horizontal gene transfer, the movement of genes between organisms rather than from parent to offspring, is common in bacteria and archaea today. Early life might have been even more promiscuous with genetic material, swapping genes frequently, creating a web of genetic exchange rather than a strict tree of descent. LUCA might have been part of a community of organisms that shared genes, and the concept of a last common ancestor might be better thought of as a population or community rather than a single cell. LUCA lived in a world radically different from ours. The Earth of 3.5 to 4 billion years ago was young, still cooling from its formation, still being shaped by impact and volcanism. The atmosphere was probably thick with carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and water vapor, but little or no free oxygen. The sky might have been orange or hazy, the sun dimmer than today because it was younger and less luminous, about 70-75% of its current brightness. The oceans were extensive, covering most of the planet, but they were different from modern oceans. They were probably warmer, perhaps 40-80 degrees Celsius in many regions, kept hot by the heat of the young planet and by a thick greenhouse atmosphere. They were acidic, at least in some regions, because the atmosphere was rich in carbon dioxide, which dissolves in water to form carbonic acid. They were rich in dissolved metal, iron, nickel, zinc, manganese, all leached from the crust by hydrothermal circulation. There was no ozone layer, no shield against ultraviolet radiation from the sun. The surface was bathed in UV light, harmful to unprotected organic molecules. Life would have needed to shelter from this radiation, perhaps living in the ocean depth, perhaps hiding under rocks or mineral layer, perhaps protected by the water itself, which absorbs UV. The continents, if they existed at all in recognizable forms, were small volcanic islands and proto-continents, constantly being built and eroded, shaped by the vigorous tectonic activity of a young planet with a hot interior. There was no soil, no vegetation, no complex terrestrial ecosystem. The land was barren, a place of rock and water and volcanic steam. Into this alien world, LUCA emerged, or perhaps more accurately, in this world, LUCA existed as part of the early bios. It was one organism among possibly many, though the only one whose lineage would survive and diversify into all of modern life. It was small, simple, fragile by modern standards, yet robust enough to survive, to reproduce, to pass on its genetic information through billions of years of change. Let's imagine, as best we can, what it would be like to encounter LUCA. You can't see it with your naked eye. It's too small. A single cell a few micrometers across, roughly the size of a modern bacterium. Even if you were there, in the ancient ocean, you'd swim through trillions of cells without knowing they existed. They're transparent, or nearly so, perhaps with a slight tint from the molecules inside, but essentially invisible in the water. To see LUCA, you'd need a microscope, a powerful one, magnifying thousands of times. Under the lens, it would appear as a tiny sphere or rod, or perhaps an irregular shape, depending on how the cell membrane formed, how the cell grew, whether it was actively dividing or quiescent. The cell membrane would be the most obvious feature, a thin boundary marking the edge of the organism, the division between self and environment. Inside, there would be no nucleus, no mitochondria, no chloroplasts, none of the internal compartments that characterize eukaryotic cells. Instead, the interior would be a relatively uniform cytoplasm, a gel-like substance filled with water, proteins, RNA, DNA, ribosomes, and various small molecules. The DNA would be concentrated in a region called the nucleoid, not separated by a membrane, but simply clustered together in the cell's center. Ribosomes would be scattered throughout the cytoplasm, dark spots under the microscope, molecular factories, busily synthesizing proteins. The cell membrane might have invagination, folds, or specialized regions where particular metabolic processes occurred, where energy was generated, or where the cell interacted with its environment. If you could somehow zoom in further, down to the molecular level, you'd see extraordinary complexity. The DNA would be a double helix, twisted and coiled, stretching perhaps 1,000,000 base pairs long, encoding perhaps 1,000 genes. The ribosomes would be intricate assemblies of RNA and protein, their structure precise and essential, unchanged in fundamental architecture over billions of years. The proteins would be diverse, some serving as enzymes, catalyzing reaction, others as structural elements, maintaining the cell's shape, still others as transporters moving molecules across membrane. And you'd see motion, constant motion. Nothing in the cell is static. Molecules are moving, diffusing, bumping into each other, reacting, breaking apart, and reforming. Enzymes are catalyzing reaction, building and breaking bonds thousands of times per second. Ribosomes are marching along messenger RNA, reading the genetic code, stringing amino acids into protein. The cell is alive, metabolically active, processing chemicals from its environment, extracting energy, building new molecules, maintaining itself, growing, preparing to divide. The environment LUCA lived in was probably a hydrothermal vent or a similar chemically active setting. Picture a crack in the ocean floor where hot, mineral-rich water rises from the crust below. The water is heated by contact with magma or hot rock deep beneath the surface, and as it rises, it leaches minerals from the rocks it passes through. When this hot water emerges into the cold ocean, minerals precipitate out, forming chimneys or mounds, structures that can grow meters tall, porous, and complex. In and around these structures, there are chemical gradients, differences in temperature, pH, and chemical composition between the hot vent water and the cold ocean. These gradients represent energy, differences that can drive chemical reaction, that can be harnessed to do work, to power life. LUCA probably lived in this environment, perhaps in the pores of the mineral structures, perhaps in the mixing zones where hot and cold water met, perhaps free-floating in the warm plumes rising from the vent. The water around LUCA would have been warm to hot, perhaps 40-80 degrees Celsius. Too hot for most modern organisms, but comfortable for thermophile, heat-loving microbes that thrive in such conditions. LUCA was probably a thermophile, or at least thermotolerant, able to survive and reproduce in warm water. This is inferred from phylogenetic analysis that suggests the deepest branches of the tree of life are occupied by thermophilic organisms. The water would have been rich in hydrogen sulfide, in carbon dioxide, in dissolved metals, all the chemicals that LUCA needed for its metabolism. Hydrogen, in particular, was probably crucial, serving as an electron donor, a source of reducing power that could drive the synthesis of organic molecules. The reaction between hydrogen and carbon dioxide to form organic compound, mediated by enzyme, would have been LUCA's primary energy source. The environment would have been dark, no sunlight penetrating to the ocean depths where LUCA lived. The only light would have been the faint glow of blackbody radiation from the hot vent water, invisible to human eyes, but detectable with infrared sensor. LUCA had no eye, no light-sensing organ, no need for them. It navigated its world through chemistry, through detecting concentration gradients of molecules in the water, through moving toward higher concentrations of nutrient, or away from harmful substances. Around LUCA, there would have been other organisms, probably. Life in its early stages was likely diverse, different lineages trying different strategies. Some might have had similar metabolisms to LUCA, competing for the same resources. Others might have had different metabolism, exploiting different chemical reactions. Some might have been predators in a sense, consuming other cells, breaking them down, recycling their components. Early life was a community, an ecosystem, not just a single organism in isolation. But of all those early organisms, only LUCA's lineage survived to the present, or at least only LUCA's lineage gave rise to all modern life. The others, if they existed, went extinct, left no descendants, or left descendants that have all since died out. We can't know for certain what happened to them, whether they were outcompeted by LUCA descendants, whether they succumbed to environmental changes, whether they simply had bad luck. But the result is clear. The tree of life traces back to LUCA, and all living things today are part of LUCA's extended family. Now let's talk about what happened after LUCA, about how the tree of life branched, about how one organism gave rise to the incredible diversity we see today. The tree of life has three main branches, three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. These are the fundamental divisions of life, more basic than the division between plants and animals, more profound than any other classification. Bacteria are the most familiar to most people, though we usually know them as germ or microbe. They're single-celled prokaryotes, without nuclei, found everywhere on Earth, from hot springs to Antarctic ice, from deep ocean vents to the human gut. They're incredibly diverse in metabolism, in shape, in ecological role. Some photosynthesize, some fix nitrogen, some cause disease, some decompose organic matter. They're essential to every ecosystem, cycling nutrients, producing oxygen, shaping the chemistry of the planet. Archaea are less familiar, discovered only in the 1970s, when scientists realized that some microbes were fundamentally different from bacteria at the molecular level. Archaea look similar to bacteria under a microscope, single-celled prokaryote, but their cell membranes are made of different lipids. Their ribosomes have different structures. Their genes are organized differently. Many archaea live in extreme environments: hot springs, salt lakes, acidic pools, though they are also found in normal environments like soil and ocean water. They have unique metabolism, including methanogenesis, the production of methane, a process found only in archaea. Eukarya, or eukaryotes, are organisms with cells that have nuclei and other membrane-bound organelles. This includes all animals, all plants, all fungi, and a diverse collection of protists, single-celled eukaryotes, that don't fit neatly into the other categories. Eukaryotic cells are generally larger and more complex than prokaryotic cells, with elaborate internal structures, compartmentalization, complex regulation. Humans are eukaryotes, as are the trees outside your window, the mushrooms in the forest, the algae in the ocean. These three domains all descend from LUCA. At some point after LUCA, the tree of life split into separate lineages that would become bacteria and archaea. Later, eukaryotes arose, possibly from archaea, possibly from a merger between archaea and bacteria. The exact branching pattern, the order in which the domains separated, is still debated, still being refined as we gather more data. But the fundamental pattern is clear. Three great branches, three domains, all rooted in LUCA. The split between bacteria and archaea happened early, probably within the first few 100 million years after LUCA. The two groups diverged, developed different characteristics, adapted to different environments or different lifestyles. Both remained single-celled and prokaryotic, but they diverged at the molecular level. Their membranes, their gene expression systems, their metabolic pathways taking different evolutionary paths. Eukaryotes came later, much later, probably around 2 billion years ago, possibly earlier. The origin of eukaryotes is one of the great mysteries in evolutionary biology, though the broad outline is increasingly clear. Eukaryotes are chimeras, organisms formed from the merger of two or more different cell types. The nuclear genome, the DNA in the nucleus, seems to be related to archaea, suggesting that the host cell that became the first eukaryote was archaeal, or archaeal-like. But eukaryotes also contain mitochondria, organelles that generate energy through aerobic respiration. Mitochondria have their own DNA, their own ribosomes, their own membrane, and these features are bacterial, not archaeal. Mitochondria descended from bacteria, specifically from a group called alpha proteobacteria, that were engulfed by the host cell in a process called endosymbiosis. Instead of being digested, these bacteria survived inside the host, formed a partnership, exchanged genes with the host, and eventually became integrated organelles, no longer able to live independently, but essential to the host's survival. This merger, this symbiotic event, was one of the most important in the history of life. It gave eukaryotes access to aerobic metabolism, to the ability to use oxygen, to extract energy from food far more efficiently than anaerobic processes could. This energy surplus allowed eukaryotes to become larger, more complex, to develop internal structures, to evolve into multicellular forms. Without mitochondria, there would be no animals, no plants, no fungi, no complex life as we know it. Some eukaryotes, the lineage that would become plants and algae, underwent a second endosymbiotic event, engulfing a photosynthetic bacterium that would become the chloroplast. Chloroplasts, like mitochondria, have their own DNA and ribosome, and they're clearly related to cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria that produce oxygen. This second merger gave plants the ability to photosynthesize, to capture sunlight, and turn it into chemical energy, to be autotrophic, self-feeding. So eukaryotes are composite, built from parts that were once separate organisms. Your cells contain the descendants of ancient bacteria, mitochondria working tirelessly to produce ATP to power your metabolism. If you're a plant, your cells also contain chloroplasts, descendants of cyanobacteria, capturing sunlight to fuel photosynthesis. You are not one organism, but many. A community, a symbiosis, a walking ecosystem. And all of this, all the bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes, all the diversity and complexity traces back to LUCA, to that single cell or community of cells living in the ancient ocean, metabolizing chemicals, replicating its DNA, passing on genetic information that would be copied and modified and passed on again through billions of generations, through countless evolutionary innovations, through mass extinctions and adaptive radiation, through ice ages and greenhouse climates, through the slow drift of continents and the rise and fall of mountain ranges, through all the changes Earth has experienced, the genetic information flowing forward, unbroken, from LUCA to every living thing today. You carry LUCA's legacy in every cell of your body. The ribosomes reading this genetic information right now in your cells are fundamentally the same as the ribosomes that existed in LUCA. The genetic code, the way DNA triplets specify amino acids, is the same code LUCA used. The ATP that powers your muscles, your neurons, your metabolism, is the same energy currency LUCA relied on. The membrane surrounding your cells, though modified and elaborated, descended from LUCA's membrane. You are LUCA's descendant. Billions of generations removed, modified by evolution into something LUCA couldn't have imagined, something complex and aware and capable of understanding its own origin. But the connection is real, unbroken, traceable through genetics, through the molecular machinery of life that we all share. Let's think about this connection more deeply, about what it means to share a common ancestor with every living thing. It means that you and a bacterium, despite looking utterly different, despite being separated by billions of years of evolution, are cousins, relatives, members of the same family. You share genes with that bacterium, not many, but some. The genes for ribosome, for basic metabolic enzymes, for DNA replication, these are conserved across all life because they were present in LUCA and have been inherited by all LUCA's descendants. It means that you and a tree are related, not metaphorically, but literally. You share a common ancestor, though you have to go back further, back past the origin of animal, past the origin of plant, back to the origin of eukaryote, and then further still to LUCA. The tree's cells have mitochondria like yours, descended from the same endosymbiotic event. The tree's ribosomes are similar to yours. The tree's genetic code is the same as yours. Your family, distant but real. It means that all life is connected, part of a single grand narrative, a story that began in the ancient ocean and continues in every forest, every field, every ocean, every soil, every extreme environment where life has managed to gain a foothold. We're all chapters in the same book, all characters in the same story, all descendants of the same origin. This is what Darwin meant when he wrote in the closing paragraph of On the Origin of Species, that there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. He recognized that all life shares a common origin, that the diversity we see arose from common ancestry through the process of descent with modification, through evolution. Modern molecular biology has confirmed and extended Darwin's insight. We now know that life descended not from a few forms, but from one, from LUCA. We can trace the tree of life back to its root with increasing precision. We can reconstruct what LUCA was like, where it lived, how it metabolized. We can see the evidence of common ancestry written in our genes, in the genes of every organism, in the universal features of life. But LUCA raises as many questions as it answers. What came before LUCA? How did life originate? Was there only one origin of life, or were there many? with LUCA being the only survivor? These questions remain at the frontier of science, subjects of intense research and debate. The origin of life is one of the great unsolved problems in science. We know that life exists, that it must have originated somehow from non-life, from chemistry. We know roughly when this happened, probably between 4.4 and 3.5 billion years ago, based on the age of the Earth and the age of the earliest evidence for life. We know roughly where, probably in the ocean, possibly around hydrothermal vents or in other chemically active environments, but we don't know exactly how. The challenge is that life is complex. Even the simplest life. A minimal cell needs a membrane to separate itself from the environment, needs genetic material to store information, needs metabolism to extract energy and build components, needs a way to replicate both its membrane and its genetic material. Getting all of these pieces to come together and work in concert seems impossibly unlikely. A chance event so improbable that it should never happen. And yet it did happen, at least once, possibly more. Life exists, which means that the improbable became actual, that the right combination of molecules in the right environment at the right time led to the first self-replicating, evolving system. LUCA was a product of this origin event, though not necessarily the immediate product. There were probably many generations, perhaps millions of years, perhaps hundreds of millions of years, between the first life and LUCA. During this time, early life would have evolved, experimented, diverged into different lineages. Some of these lineages probably went extinct, dead ends, that left no descendants. Others persisted for a time, but eventually died out. Only one lineage, or a community of closely related organisms exchanging genes, survived to become LUCA and give rise to all modern life. This means LUCA was not the first life, but the last common ancestor of existing life. There might have been organisms before LUCA, organisms contemporary with LUCA, that have left no descendant, that have been lost to extinction. We'll never know about them unless we find some evidence, some fossil or chemical signature that reveals their existence. But based on current evidence, all life we know traces back to LUCA and everything. Before LUCA is inference and speculation. Some scientists speculate about a pre-LUCA world, a time when life was more diverse, when there were multiple lineages with different genetic systems, different metabolisms, different structures. Perhaps early life used RNA instead of DNA for genetic storage, in what's called the RNA world hypothesis. RNA can both store information and catalyze reactions, making it a potentially simpler genetic molecule than DNA, which requires proteins for replication and expression. Perhaps early life had simpler membranes, made of different lipids, or even different types of molecules, membranes that were easier to form, but less stable than modern membrane. Perhaps early life had simpler metabolism, using geochemical energy sources that are no longer available or no longer exploitable because the chemistry of the ocean and atmosphere has changed. Perhaps there were multiple origins of life, different lineages arising independently from chemistry, competing in the early oceans until one outcompeted the others, until LUCA's lineage became dominant, and eventually the only one surviving. This is purely speculative, but it's not impossible. If life originated once, it could have originated multiple times, given the right conditions and enough time. But whether life originated once or many times, whether LUCA was alone or part of a diverse community, the result is the same. All modern life descends from LUCA. The tree of life has a single root, or at least a single root that we can detect through genetics. Everything alive today is part of LUCA's family, part of the lineage that survived, while others, if they existed, did not. This raises a philosophical question, one that touches on the nature of life, of identity, of continuity across time. In what sense are you the same entity as LUCA? You don't share much genetic material, only the most conserved gene. You don't look anything alike, you being a large multicellular organism, and LUCA being a microscopic single cell. You don't have the same metabolism, the same structure, the same way of life. And yet, there's an unbroken line of descent connecting you to LUCA, a chain of parents and offspring stretching across billions of years. Every organism in that chain was alive, was functional, was capable of surviving and reproducing. Each passed genetic information to the next, sometimes with errors, with mutation, but always enough information to maintain life, to build a functioning organism. From LUCA to you, there has never been a break in the chain, never a generation that failed to reproduce, never an extinction event that wiped out your lineage. This is true for every living thing. Every bacterium, every tree, every animal has an unbroken line back to LUCA. We're all survivor, descendants of survivor, the product of billions of years of successful reproduction. Every one of your ancestors, going back to LUCA and beyond, lived long enough to reproduce. Not a single one failed in that fundamental task, because if they had, you wouldn't be here. There's something profound in that realization, something humbling and awe-inspiring. You exist because of an unbroken chain of survival stretching across most of Earth's history. You carry within you the legacy of that survival, the adaptations and innovations that allowed your ancestors to persist through changing environment, through competition and predation, through ice ages and warm periods, through mass extinctions and evolutionary radiation. And you carry LUCA's legacy most directly in your cells, in the molecular machinery that keeps you alive. The ribosomes that are translating genetic information in your cells right now are descendants of LUCA's ribosome, modified and refined, but fundamentally the same. The genetic code that specifies how your proteins are built is the same code LUCA used, with only minor variation. The ATP that powers your cellular processes is the same energy currency LUCA relied on. In a very real sense, you are LUCA, or at least you contain LUCA within you, not as a separate entity, but as a set of inherited features, as molecular structures and processes that have been passed down through generation, modified but never abandoned, essential now as they were then. LUCA lives on in you, in every organism, in the shared heritage of all life. Let's think about time for a moment, about the vast expanse separating you from LUCA. If we compress Earth's 4.5 billion year history into a single 24-hour day, LUCA appears around 4 or 5 in the morning, in the very early hours. The first eukaryotes don't appear until mid-afternoon. The first animals appear around 9 p.m. Dinosaurs rule from about 11:30 p.m. to 11:40 p.m. Humans appear at 11:59-58 p.m. in the last 2 seconds of the day. All of recorded human history, all of civilization, all of writing and agriculture and cities and technology happens in a fraction of the last second. LUCA existed for most of that day, not as an individual organism, but as a lineage, as descendants continuously modifying and branching. By the time the first animals appeared, LUCA's lineage had already been evolving for about 3 billion years, 3/4 of Earth's history. By the time humans appeared, LUCA's descendants had been diversifying for nearly 4 billion years. This timescale is almost impossible to comprehend. A human lifetime is perhaps 80 years. LUCA lived 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, which is roughly 44 million human lifetimes ago. If you tried to count back to LUCA 1 generation per second, it would take you over a century just to count the generations separating you from LUCA, and that's assuming generation times of only 20 years throughout, which vastly underestimates the rapid generation times of early life. The point is that LUCA is ancient beyond our normal ability to grasp, separated from us by a chasm of time so vast that almost everything about Earth has changed in the interval. The continents have drifted, merged, broken apart, drifted again. Mountain ranges have risen and eroded away. Oceans have opened and closed. The atmosphere has been transformed from oxygen poor to oxygen rich. The climate has swung from icehouse to greenhouse and back again, multiple times. Asteroids have struck the planet, causing mass extinction. Life itself has transformed Earth, producing oxygen, creating soil, shaping the chemistry of the ocean and atmosphere. Through all of this, through all these changes, the genetic information that was present in LUCA has flowed forward, copied and recopied billions upon billions of time, modified by mutation and selection, but never destroyed, never completely overwritten. Some of LUCA's genes are still recognizable in your genome, still performing similar functions, still essential to life. This continuity across such vast time is one of the most remarkable features of life. Information persists, not perfectly. Mutations accumulate, genes duplicate and diverge, genomes are rearranged and restructured, but enough information persists that we can trace relationships back billions of years, that we can reconstruct what LUCA was like, that we can identify molecular structures that have been conserved since the very beginning of life. The ribosome is perhaps the best example. Ribosomes in bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes are similar enough that they clearly share a common ancestor, clearly descended from the ribosomes that existed in LUCA. The ribosomal RNA, the structural RNA that forms the core of the ribosome, has been called the most conserved molecule in biology. Parts of it are virtually identical across all domains of life, unchanged over billions of years, because any change would be fatal, would break the delicate machinery that translates genes into protein. When scientists want to determine evolutionary relationships between organisms, they often sequence ribosomal RNA, particularly a molecule called 16S rRNA in prokaryotes, or 18S rRNA in eukaryotes. These molecules evolve slowly enough that they retain information about ancient relationships, but fast enough that they differ between species, allowing us to construct phylogenetic trees to determine who's related to whom, to trace the branches of the tree of life. This is how the three domains, bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, were discovered. In the 1970s, Carl Woese and his colleagues sequenced ribosomal RNA from various microorganisms and realized that some microbes that had been classified as bacteria were fundamentally different at the molecular level. They formed a separate group, now called archaea, distinct from bacteria and from eukaryotes. This was a revolutionary discovery, revealing that the basic organization of life was more complex than previously thought, that there were three great branches, not two. The discovery of archaea also provided clues about LUCA. By comparing the three domains, by looking at what features they shared and what features differed, scientists could infer what LUCA was like. Features shared by all three domains were probably present in LUCA. Features found in only one or two domains probably evolved after the domains diverged. This comparative approach has limitations. Features can be lost during evolution, so the absence of a feature in modern organisms doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't present in LUCA. Features can also be gained through horizontal gene transfer, so the presence of a gene in all three domains doesn't automatically mean it was inherited from LUCA. It could have been transferred between domains after they diverge, and some features might have evolved independently in different lineages, converging on similar solutions to similar problems. Despite these complications, phylogenetic analysis has been enormously successful at reconstructing deep evolutionary history. We now have a reasonably clear picture of LUCA, one that has been refined and tested as more genomes are sequenced, as new organisms are discovered, as analytical methods improve. One of the most intriguing aspects of LUCA research is trying to determine what LUCA couldn't do. What capabilities evolved after LUCA, after the Tree of Life branch? We've already mentioned photosynthesis, which probably evolved independently in bacteria and later was acquired by eukaryotes through endosymbiosis. But there are other metabolisms, other capabilities that also evolved after LUCA. Nitrogen fixation, the ability to convert atmospheric nitrogen gas into ammonia that can be used to build proteins and nucleic acids, is probably post-LUCA. Only some bacteria and archaea can fix nitrogen, and the genes involved are complex and seem to have evolved after the domains diverged. LUCA probably relied on fixed nitrogen from the environment, perhaps ammonia produced by geological processes, perhaps nitrogen compounds delivered by meteorites or produced by lightning. Oxygen respiration, the use of oxygen as an electron acceptor in metabolism, definitely evolved after LUCA, because oxygen wasn't available in significant quantities until cyanobacteria evolved oxygenic photosynthesis and began pumping oxygen into the atmosphere around 2.4 billion years ago. LUCA lived in an anaerobic world, a world without free oxygen, and its metabolism was adapted to those conditions. The ability to survive in extreme cold probably evolved after LUCA. LUCA was likely a thermophile, living in warm to hot environment. The ability to survive near freezing, to remain active in cold water or ice, required adaptation, antifreeze protein, cold-adapted enzyme, modified membrane, that evolved later as organisms colonized colder environment. The ability to form spores, dormant resistant structures that can survive harsh conditions for extended periods, probably evolved after LUCA. Spore formation is complex, requiring coordinated changes in cell structure and metabolism, and it's found only in some bacteria and some fungi, suggesting it evolved independently in different lineages. The ability to move actively through flagella or other motility structures might have evolved after LUCA, or might have been present in LUCA and lost in some lineages. This is debated. Bacterial flagella and archaeal flagella are structurally different, suggesting they evolved independently, which would mean LUCA was non-modal, drifting with currents or chemical gradients. But some researchers argue for a primitive motility system in LUCA that later diverged into the different systems we see today. The ability to sense and respond to environmental stimuli was probably present in LUCA in some form, because even the simplest cells need to respond to their environment, to move toward nutrients or away from toxins, to adjust their metabolism to changing conditions. But the sophisticated sensory systems we see in modern organisms, chemoreceptors, photoreceptors, mechanoreceptors, probably evolved after LUCA. Elaborations on simpler ancestral systems. What's clear is that LUCA, while possessing the fundamental machinery of life, was simpler and more limited than most modern organisms. It was probably restricted to a narrow range of environment, those providing the specific chemical conditions it needed for metabolism. It probably had a smaller genome than most modern free-living organisms, encoding fewer genes, fewer capabilities. It was the starting point, the foundation, on which billions of years of evolution would build, and build it did, elaborately and diversely. From LUCA's descendants came organisms adapted to every environment on Earth, extremophiles that thrive in boiling acid, in concentrated salt, in radioactive waste, in rock kilometers beneath the surface. Photosynthetic organisms that converted sunlight into chemical energy, transforming Earth's atmosphere and enabling the evolution of complex life. Multicellular organisms that developed specialized tissue, organ, complex behaviors, predators and prey, parasites and hosts, symbionts and competitors, all the intricate relationships that characterize modern ecosystems. The diversification of life from LUCA to the present represents the most complex and extended creative process we know of. It wasn't directed, wasn't planned, wasn't working toward any goal. It was simply the result of variation and selection, of organisms reproducing with slight modifications, of those modifications being tested by the environment, of successful variants leaving more descendants. Over billions of years, this simple process generated all the complexity and diversity we see. Consider the human eye, often cited as an example of biological complexity. It seems impossible that something so intricate, with so many precisely coordinated parts, lens, iris, retina, optic nerve, visual cortex, could arise through unguided evolution. And yet, it did, through countless small steps, each improving vision slightly, each providing an advantage to organisms that possessed it. We can trace the evolution of eyes through comparative anatomy and genetics. The simplest light-sensing organs are just patches of light-sensitive cells, found in some simple animals today. These allow the organism to detect light and dark, to orient toward or away from light. Add a depression or cup around these cells, and you can detect the direction light is coming from. Add a narrow opening, a pinhole, and you get a sharper image. Add a lens to focus light, and vision becomes sharper still. Add muscles to adjust the lens, a pupil to control light intake, specialized photoreceptors for color and fine detail, and you get an eye like ours. Each step in this progression was functional, was useful, was an improvement over the previous state. Eyes didn't evolve all at once, in one improbable leap, but through many small steps, each selected for, because it improved survival or reproduction. And eyes evolved independently multiple times, in vertebrates, in mollusks like octopuses, in arthropods like insects, each time following a similar path from simple to complex, each time producing a functional organ for vision. The same story can be told for any complex feature. Wings evolved from forelimbs used for other purposes, for climbing, for grasping, for insulation, gradually modified for flight through small steps, each functional, each useful. The human brain evolved from simpler nervous system, adding layers of complexity, forebrain structures for learning and memory, cortical areas for language and abstract thought, each addition providing advantages in a social, cognitively demanding environment. All of this complexity, all of this diversity, traces back to LUCA, to a simple cell or community of cells with only the basic machinery of life. LUCA didn't have eyes or wings or brain. LUCA didn't photosynthesize, didn't fix nitrogen, didn't respire oxygen. But LUCA had what was necessary: genetic material that could be copied and modified, metabolism that could extract energy and build structures, a membrane that separated self from environment, a way to reproduce. These fundamental features, these innovations that arose before LUCA, or in LUCA, were enough. They were sufficient for life to persist, to evolve, to diversify, to colonize the planet, to transform the environment, to create the biosphere we inhabit today. There's a concept in evolutionary biology called frozen accident, describing features that became fixed early in life's history and then couldn't be changed because too many other things depended on them. The genetic code is often cited as a frozen accident. The specific mapping of DNA triplets to amino acids seems arbitrary. There's no chemical reason why the codon UO has to specify the amino acid phenylalanine. But once that mapping was established in early life, once many genes were built, assuming that mapping, it became impossible to change without breaking everything. LUCA represents a collection of frozen accident, features that became established early and then were inherited by all descendants because changing them was too disruptive. The structure of the ribosome, the basic mechanism of DNA replication, the use of ATP as energy currency, the composition of cell membrane. These features are so fundamental, so deeply embedded in the machinery of life, that they've been conserved for billions of years. This is why we can recognize LUCA's legacy in ourselves, why we share molecular features with bacteria and archaea despite billions of years of divergence. These features are frozen, unchangeable, without destroying life itself, so they persist. Markers of our common ancestry, molecular fossils that testify to our connection with all living things. But while some features are frozen, others are remarkably fluid, changing rapidly in response to environmental pressures, generating diversity and adaptation. Genes that interact directly with the environment, genes for metabolic enzyme, for cell surface protein, for toxins or resistances, evolve quickly, modified by mutation and selection to meet changing challenges. This combination of conserved core and variable periphery is characteristic of biological systems. The fundamental machinery, DNA replication, protein synthesis, energy metabolism is ancient and conserved. The specific adaptations, particular enzymes, specific regulatory systems, detailed morphologies are more recent and variable. Evolution is conservative in its core, but innovative at its edges. LUCA exemplifies this. LUCA had the conserved core, the fundamental machinery that would be inherited by all descendants. But LUCA's specific adaptations, its exact metabolism, its membrane composition, its regulatory systems were just starting points. Templates that would be modified, elaborated, sometimes completely replaced as its descendants adapted to new environment, new opportunities, new challenges. Let's think about the environment LUCA lived in more carefully, because understanding that environment helps us understand LUCA itself, helps us see why LUCA was the way it was, why certain features were adaptive, why LUCA's lineage survived while others, if they existed, did not. The early Earth was a harsh place by modern standard, but it was also a place of opportunity, a place where chemical energy was abundant, where the basic elements needed for life, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, were available, where liquid water existed in vast quantity, providing a medium for chemistry, for life. The ocean was probably the primary habitat for early life. Water is essential for life as we know it, serving as a solvent, a medium for chemical reactions, a source of hydrogen. The early ocean was warm, kept hot by the greenhouse atmosphere and by the residual heat of Earth's formation. It was also chemically different from the modern ocean, richer in dissolved metals, more acidic in some regions, lacking the oxygen that characterizes modern seawater. Within this ocean, there were regions of intense chemical activity, places where different water masses mixed, where hot water from the crust met cold surface water, where reduced chemicals from the interior encountered oxidized chemicals from the surface. These regions, these chemical gradients, represented energy sources, opportunities for organisms that could harness the energy of chemical disequilibrium. Hydrothermal vents are the most famous of these regions, and they're often proposed as the birthplace of life, the environment where LUCA lived. These vents, found along mid-ocean ridges and other tectonically active regions, discharge hot mineral-rich water from the crust into the cold ocean. The temperature difference can be hundreds of degrees. The chemical difference is equally stark. Around these vents, minerals precipitate as the hot water cools, forming chimneys and mounds, porous structures that provide surfaces for chemical reaction, compartments that concentrate molecules, gradients that drive the flow of energy and material. Some scientists propose that life originated in these structures, that the pores and channels served as natural compartments, protocells before cells existed, places where chemistry became organized, where self-replicating molecules arose. Whether or not life originated at hydrothermal vent, there's good evidence that LUCA lived in such an environment, or something similar. The genes LUCA possessed, reconstructed through phylogenetic analysis, include many associated with thermophilic metabolism, with the use of hydrogen and hydrogen sulfide, with the reduction of carbon dioxide to organic molecules, all characteristics of organisms living around modern hydrothermal vents. Some modern organisms, particularly certain archaea and bacteria, still live in vent environments, still use the same basic metabolisms that LUCA probably used. They're called living fossils in a metabolic sense, not because they haven't evolved, they've evolved extensively, but because they preserve the basic metabolic strategy that arose in early life, the strategy that allowed LUCA to survive and thrive in the ancient ocean. These organisms show us what life in LUCA's environment might have been like. They form communities around vent, dense populations supported by the chemical energy flowing from the Earth's interior. They're the base of food chain, primary producers that build organic matter from inorganic chemicals, supporting animal, tube worm, clam, crabs that either harbor symbiotic vent bacteria or feed on free-living ones. LUCA wouldn't have had these complex ecological relationships. There were no animals in LUCA's time, no eukaryotes, possibly only microbes. But there were probably communities, populations of cells living together, possibly competing for resources, possibly exchanging genes, possibly forming primitive symbiosis or dependency. The concept of LUCA as a single organism is probably an oversimplification. LUCA might have been a population, a community of similar organisms that shared genes through horizontal gene transfer, that hadn't yet differentiated into distinct species. Early life might have been more like a web than a tree, with genetic material flowing freely between organisms, with the concept of species not yet meaningful. This idea, sometimes called the communal or collective ancestor hypothesis, suggests that LUCA wasn't a single cell, but a community of cells with porous boundaries between lineages, with genetic material shared promiscuously, with the evolutionary units being genes or modules rather than whole organisms. As life evolved, as organisms became more complex and specialized, gene transfer became less common. Boundaries between lineages solidified, and the tree of life emerged from the web of life. This hypothesis is controversial and difficult to test because the evidence has been obscured by billions of years of subsequent evolution, but it's consistent with what we see in modern bacteria and archaea, which engage in extensive horizontal gene transfer, which can pick up genes from distantly related organisms, which blur the boundaries between species in ways that would be impossible for animals or plants. If LUCA was a community rather than an individual, it changes how we think about the origin of the three domains. The split between bacteria, archaea, and eukarya might not have been a simple branching event, one lineage splitting into two and then three. Instead, it might have been a gradual process, with different subgroups in the LUCA community specializing, differentiating, eventually becoming distinct enough that we recognize them as separate domains. But regardless of whether LUCA was an individual or a community, the fundamental point remains. All modern life descends from this ancestral population, inherits genes and structures from this ancient source, carries forward the legacy of life's earliest successful forms. Let's consider what it would take to find direct evidence of LUCA, to move beyond genetic reconstruction to physical evidence. Could we ever find fossils of LUCA? Could we find chemical signatures that would tell us directly what LUCA was like, where it lived, how it metabolized? The challenge is time and geology. LUCA lived 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, in the Eoarchean, or perhaps late Hadean eon, a time from which very few rocks survive. The Earth's crust is constantly being recycled through plate tectonic, with old rocks being subducted into the mantle, melted, and eventually returned to the surface as new rock. Rocks older than 4 billion years are exceedingly rare, found in only a few locations worldwide, and they've been heavily altered by heat, pressure, and chemical reactions over the eon. The oldest known rocks that might contain evidence of life are about 3.7 to 3.8 billion years old, found in Greenland. These rocks contain stromatolite, layered structures that might have been formed by microbial mats, communities of bacteria and archaea, growing in shallow water, trapping sediment, building up layer by layer. But even these structures are controversial, with some scientists arguing they're geological rather than biological, formed by chemical precipitation rather than microbial activity. The oldest accepted fossils are microfossils, microscopic structures that look like cells, found in rocks about 3.5 billion years old from Western Australia. These structures are similar in size and shape to modern bacteria. and they're found in rocks that were once sediments in a shallow marine environment. Most scientists accept these as genuine fossils, evidence that life existed 3.5 billion years ago. Though some skeptics argue they could be abiotic structures, minerals that coincidentally look like cells. But even if these fossils are genuine, they're not fossils of LUCA. They're fossils of LUCA's descendants, organisms that had already diversified, that had already adapted to their specific environment. LUCA lived earlier, before these organisms existed, or at least before the organisms that left these specific fossils existed. And LUCA's environment, probably deep ocean hydrothermal vents, is unlikely to preserve fossils. The rocks formed in those settings are typically metamorphosed, altered by heat and pressure, destroying any microscopic structures that might have been preserved. So direct fossil evidence of LUCA is probably impossible. The rocks from LUCA's time are too rare, too altered, too unlikely to have preserved microscopic cells, even if they were fossilized originally. We'll almost certainly never see an image of LUCA under a microscope, never find its physical remains. But there are other types of evidence, chemical evidence, that might tell us about early life. Carbon isotopes, for example, can indicate biological activity. Living organisms prefer the lighter isotope of carbon, carbon-12, over the heavier carbon-13. When organisms fix carbon dioxide into organic matter, they selectively incorporate carbon-12, leaving the environment slightly enriched in carbon-13. This fractionation creates a signature, a difference in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 that indicates biological activity. The oldest rocks contain carbon, sometimes in graphite form, sometimes as organic matter preserved in sediment. This carbon shows isotopic fractionation, consistent with biological activity, suggesting that life existed when these rocks formed, around 3.7 to 3.8 billion years ago, possibly earlier. Some rocks from Jack Hills in Australia, containing zircon crystals, 4.1 billion years old with carbon inclusions, have been claimed to show biological signature, though this is highly controversial and disputed by many researchers. If these early carbon signatures are genuinely biological, they tell us that life existed very early in Earth's history, possibly within a few 100 million years of the planet's formation. This would mean that life arose quickly once conditions were right, that the transition from chemistry to biology wasn't an improbable fluke, but an almost inevitable consequence of the right environment and chemistry. But even these carbon signatures don't tell us about LUCA specifically. They tell us that some form of life existed, that organisms were fixing carbon, but not what those organisms were like. Not whether they were LUCA or LUCA's ancestors or unrelated organisms that left no descendant. The isotopic signature of carbon fixation is similar across different metabolism, making it difficult to determine specifically how these ancient organisms were living. Other chemical signatures might be more informative. Lipid biomarkers, organic molecules derived from cell membranes, can sometimes survive in ancient rocks and can indicate what types of organisms were present. Different groups of organisms produce different lipids, and these can be distinguished chemically, even in very old rocks. Researchers have found what might be sterane molecules, derived from sterols produced by eukaryotes, in rocks 2.7 billion years old, suggesting that eukaryotes might have arisen earlier than traditionally thought. But such findings are controversial, because these molecules could be contaminants from younger rock, or could have been produced by bacteria through different pathways, or could have been chemically altered over billions of years in ways that make interpretation difficult. For LUCA, living 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, any lipid biomarkers would have been destroyed or altered beyond recognition. The temperatures and pressures that rocks undergo over such timescales break down complex organic molecules, leaving at best fragments, at worst nothing detectable. So we're left with genetics, with comparative genomics, with phylogenetics as our primary tool for reconstructing LUCA. This is a powerful tool, more powerful than it might seem, because the genetic information in living organisms is essentially a historical record, a chronicle of evolutionary changes, a text that can be read by those who understand the language. Every genome is a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written and rewritten over billions of years, with older information partially preserved beneath newer editions, with traces of ancient events still visible if you know where to look. Pseudogenes, broken, non-functional genes, are evidence of past functions that are no longer needed. Transposable elements, sequences that copy themselves and insert randomly into genomes, are fossils of ancient efficient genomic parasite. Gene duplication, where one gene is copied and the two copies diverge, are evidence of evolutionary innovation, of new functions arising from old templates. By carefully comparing genomes, by identifying which genes are shared, which are unique, which have been duplicated or transferred or lost, scientists can reconstruct evolutionary history. It's detective work, piecing together a story from clues scattered across billions of years, and it requires sophisticated statistical methods, powerful computers, and careful attention to potential confounding factors. But it works. The tree of life reconstructed from molecular data is consistent with the tree reconstructed from anatomy and fossils, where fossils are available. The timing of evolutionary events inferred from molecular clocks, the accumulation of mutations at roughly constant rates, matches reasonably well with geological evidence. The picture of LUCA that emerges from this work is coherent, consistent across different genes and different analytical methods. LUCA was real. LUCA lived. LUCA possessed certain genes, certain metabolic capability, certain structures, and from LUCA, all modern life descended, inheriting and modifying the genetic blueprint that LUCA carried, elaborating on it, adapting it to new circumstances, but never completely abandoning it, never starting fresh. This continuity, this thread of genetic information, stretching from LUCA to the present, is what makes life on Earth a unity, what makes all organisms family. We're not separate creation, not independent origin. We're all branches on the same tree, all offshoots from the same root, all participants in the same grand evolutionary experiment. And this has implications, profound implications, for how we think about life, about our place in nature, about our responsibilities to other living things. If all life is family, if we share common ancestry with every organism, then the boundaries we draw between ourselves and other life are arbitrary, matters of degree rather than kind. We're not fundamentally different from other animals, just more recently diverged from them than from bacteria or plants. Animals are not fundamentally different from plants, just members of different branches on the eukaryotic tree. This doesn't mean there are no real differences, no meaningful distinctions. Obviously, humans are different from bacteria in important ways: size, complexity, consciousness, capability. But these differences are the result of evolution, of billions of years of divergence and specialization. At the level of fundamental biochemistry, at the level of basic cellular machinery, we're remarkably similar, almost identical in some respect. This perspective can foster humility, can remind us that we're part of nature, not separate from it, not above it. We're clever animals, capable of language and abstract thought and technology. But we're still animals, still organisms subject to the same biological constraints as everything else. We need food, water, energy. We're vulnerable to disease, to environmental changes, to disruptions in the ecosystems we depend on. We're not exempt from evolution, not beyond natural selection, not immune to extinction. Many species have gone extinct in Earth's history. Perhaps 99% or more of all species that have ever lived. Some went extinct due to bad luck, to asteroid impacts, or volcanic eruptions, or climatic shifts they couldn't adapt to quickly enough. Others were outcompeted by more efficient species, by organisms better adapted to changing conditions. Extinction is the normal fate of species over long timescales. Only a tiny fraction of the organisms that have ever lived have descendants alive today. Humans are not guaranteed survival. Our lineage, unbroken from LUCA to the present, could end if we're not careful, if we destroy our environment, if we fail to adapt to the changes we've created. Climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, nuclear weapons, these are threats of our own making. Threats that could disrupt the ecosystems we depend on, could make Earth less habitable, could even potentially end our species. But the perspective of deep time, of evolutionary history, can also be hopeful. Life has survived worse than anything humans have done so far. Life survived the late heavy bombardment, a period about 4 billion years ago, when asteroids pelted the inner solar system, possibly sterilizing Earth's surface multiple times. Life survived the Great Oxidation Event, about 2.4 billion years ago, when photosynthetic bacteria began producing oxygen, transforming the atmosphere, poisoning most organisms that couldn't tolerate oxygen, triggering a mass extinction. Life survived Snowball Earth, periods when the planet was entirely covered in ice, when temperatures plummeted, when only organisms in refugia, volcanic vents, deep ocean, equatorial regions could survive. Life survived the Permian-Triassic extinction about 252 million years ago, the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, when about 90% of species died out, when life came closer to complete annihilation than at any other time. Life recovered from all of these catastrophes, diversified, filled empty niches, experimented with new form. Life is resilient, not in the sense that individual organisms or even species are resilient, but in the sense that the process of evolution, the generation of variation, and its testing through selection is robust, capable of finding solutions to almost any challenge given enough time. LUCA is evidence of this resilience. LUCA's lineage survived when others, if they existed, did not. LUCA's descendants adapted to every environment on Earth, from boiling springs to frozen tundra, from acidic lakes to alkaline soda pools, from the deep ocean to the upper atmosphere. Life found a way, as the saying goes. But this resilience shouldn't make us complacent. Individual species, including humans, can and do go extinct. Mass extinctions eliminate most species, allowing only a small fraction to survive and diversify afterward. We should not assume that humans, or any particular species we care about, will necessarily survive if we're not careful stewards of the environment. The story of LUCA reminds us of our deep connection to all life, of our shared heritage, of our place in the grand sweep of evolutionary history. It can inspire wonder, humility, a sense of responsibility. We're not separate from nature, but part of it. Recent branches on an ancient tree, beneficiaries of billions of years of evolutionary innovation, inheritors of the machinery of life that arose in LUCA and has been refined and elaborated by every generation since. Let's return for a moment to that picture of LUCA, that microscopic cell in warm water, metabolizing chemicals, replicating its DNA, preparing to divide. Imagine watching it divide, the cell membrane pinching inward, the chromosome being pulled to opposite ends of the cell, the cytoplasm segregating. Two daughter cells where there was one. Those daughter cells are slightly different from each other and from their parent. Mutations have occurred, errors in DNA replication, changes in the genetic sequence. Most of these mutations are neutral, having no effect on the organism's function. Some are harmful, breaking genes or disrupting metabolism, and cells carrying these mutations will likely die or reproduce less successfully. A few are beneficial, improving some function, providing an advantage. The beneficial mutations, rare though they are, will tend to increase in frequency over generation because the cells carrying them reproduce more successfully. This is natural selection, the differential survival and reproduction of variant, the engine of evolution. It's automatic, requiring no guidance, no plan, no intelligence. It's simply the logical consequence of variation, inheritance, and differential success. Now imagine this process continuing, generation after generation, for billions of years. Mutations accumulate, populations diverge as they adapt to different environments, develop different metabolism, exploit different resources. Eventually, the divergence is so great that populations can no longer exchange genes, can no longer be considered part of the same lineage. They've become separate species, separate branches on the tree of life. This process, repeated countless times, generates the diversity we see today. Every branching point on the tree of life represents a divergence, a splitting of one population into two or more, each going its own evolutionary way. Some branches flourish, diversify further, give rise to major groups of organisms. Other branches wither, go extinct, leaving no descendant. LUCA sits at the root of this tree, the last common point before the great divergence that would create bacteria, archaea, and eventually eukaryote. Every organism alive today traces its lineage back through this tree to LUCA, though the paths are long and winding, through countless branching points, through billions of generations. Your own lineage, traced backward, goes through your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, through countless human ancestors, through the origin of Homo sapiens about 300,000 years ago, through earlier hominins, through the primate lineage, through early mammals, through the origin of mammals about 200 million years ago, through early amniotes, through the first tetrapods venturing onto land about 375 million years ago, through the origin of jawed vertebrates, through the Cambrian explosion about 540 million years ago, when most major animal groups appeared, through the origin of animals about 800 million years ago, or possibly earlier, through the origin of multicellular eukaryotes, through the origin of eukaryotes about 2 billion years ago, through the divergence of the three domain, back to LUCA. Every step in that lineage represents an organism that lived, that survived, that reproduced. Every step is a link in an unbroken chain stretching across most of Earth's history. Break any link, and you wouldn't exist. If any of your ancestors had failed to reproduce, had died before passing on their genes, the chain would end and you would never be born. This is true for every organism. Every living thing is the product of an unbroken chain of successful ancestors stretching back to LUCA. We're all winners in the lottery of life. all descendants of survivors, all carrying forward the legacy of billions of years of evolutionary success. But it's not just success, it's also adaptation, innovation, experimentation. Evolution is creative in a very real sense, generating forms and functions that never existed before, solving problems in novel ways, exploring the space of possible organisms. Consider the eye again, that complex organ that seems designed. It wasn't designed, but it was shaped, molded by selection, into an effective tool for gathering information about the environment. The particular solution that evolved in vertebrates, a camera eye with lens and retina, is different from the solution that evolved in insects, a compound eye with thousands of tiny lenses, which is different again from the solution in octopuses, which have camera eyes like vertebrates, but with different developmental origins and structure. These different solutions to the same problem, seeing, illustrate how evolution explores multiple paths, how similar challenges can be met with different innovation. There's no single correct way to build an eye. Evolution found many ways, each effective in its context, each the result of countless small modifications over millions of years. The same creativity appears throughout the history of life. Flight evolved independently at least 4 times, in insects, in pterosaurs, in birds, in bats, each time using different structure, different mechanism, but achieving the same function. Bioluminescence, the ability to produce light, evolved independently dozens of times in different groups of organisms, using different chemical pathways, but serving similar purposes, attracting prey, finding mates, communicating, deterring predators. This convergent evolution, where different lineages independently evolve similar features, shows that evolution is not entirely random. There are constraints, physical, and chemical laws that limit what's possible. Ecological pressures that favor certain solutions over others. Given similar challenges and sufficient time, evolution tends to find similar solutions, even starting from very different ancestral conditions. But there's also divergent evolution, where related organisms evolve in radically different directions. All mammals share a common ancestor, a small, furry creature that lived about 200 million years ago during the age of dinosaurs. From that ancestor came mice and whales, bats and elephants, humans and kangaroos, an astonishing diversity of forms and lifestyles, all variations on the basic mammalian body plan. This divergence was driven by adaptation to different environments, different ecological niches. The ancestor of whales returned to the ocean, gradually losing its legs, developing flippers and tail flukes, streamlining its body, modifying its respiratory system to allow deep diving. The ancestor of bats developed elongated finger bones supporting wing membrane, allowing powered flight. The ancestor of humans developed larger brain, bipedal locomotion, manual dexterity for tool use. These transformations required millions of years, countless generations, innumerable small modifications accumulating gradually. No single step was dramatic or miraculous. Each was a small change. A slightly longer finger bone, a slightly larger brain region, a slightly more efficient lung that provided a small advantage, that was favored by selection, that became more common in the population. Multiply these small changes over millions of generations, and you get the major transformations we see in the fossil record. The transitions from fish to amphibian, from reptiles to mammals, from dinosaurs to birds. Each transition was gradual, with intermediates showing combinations of ancestral and derived features, blurring the boundaries between groups. This is why the concept of species becomes fuzzy. When we look at evolutionary timescales, species are distinct at any moment in time, but over millions of years, one species grades into another through a series of intermediates. The boundary between fish and amphibian is arbitrary, drawn for convenience, but not reflecting a sharp transition. There were organisms that were partly fish and partly amphibian, organisms that would be hard to classify using modern categories. The same is true for the boundary between non-life and life, between chemistry and biology. LUCA was clearly alive by any reasonable definition, but LUCA's ancestors, going back toward the origin of life, become progressively simpler, less obviously alive, until at some point we reach systems that are hard to classify as either living or non-living. These proto-life systems, whatever they were, probably consisted of self-replicating molecules, perhaps RNA or something simpler, enclosed in simple membrane or adsorbed on mineral surfaces, metabolizing in a very basic sense by catalyzing reaction that produced more of themselves. They wouldn't have looked alive, wouldn't have moved or grown in obvious ways, but they would have possessed the basic features of life: replication, variation, Evolution. The transition from these proto-life systems to cells like LUCA required many innovations: more stable genetic material, DNA instead of RNA, more efficient energy metabolism, more sophisticated membranes, regulatory systems to control gene expression, division mechanisms to ensure both daughter cells receive genetic material. Each innovation made the system more robust, more competitive, more capable of surviving and reproducing. By the time LUCA existed, these innovations were in place. LUCA was a fully functional cell, capable of independent life, possessing all the basic machinery that we still see in cells today. LUCA was the product of evolution, shaped by selection from earlier, simpler form, but LUCA was also the progenitor, the starting point for all subsequent evolution. This dual role, product and progenitor, is what makes LUCA so significant. LUCA represents both the culmination of early evolution and the beginning of the major diversification that would fill Earth with life. LUCA is a pivot point, a hinge in the history of life, the moment when the basic machinery was established and the great radiation could begin. After LUCA, evolution accelerated in some sense, not in the rate of mutation, but in the rate of innovation, the generation of novelty. As organisms diversified, as they adapted to different environments, they developed new capabilities, new metabolism, new structures. The three domains diverged, each exploring different evolutionary possibilities, each generating its own diversity. Bacteria became extraordinarily diverse in metabolism, developing pathways to extract energy from almost any chemical gradient, any source of electrons and carbon. Some bacteria learned to photosynthesize using light to split water, releasing oxygen as a waste product. This was one of the most consequential innovations in Earth's history, transforming the planet, creating an oxygen-rich atmosphere, driving the evolution of aerobic respiration, enabling the evolution of complex multicellular life, the oxygenation of Earth's atmosphere. Beginning about 2.4 billion years ago in what's called the Great Oxidation Event, was a catastrophe for many organisms. Oxygen is reactive, toxic to organisms adapted to anaerobic conditions. Many lineages probably went extinct, unable to cope with the rising oxygen level. But other lineages developed enzymes to neutralize oxygen's harmful effect, eventually learned to use oxygen as an electron acceptor, as fuel for a highly efficient metabolism. This new metabolism, aerobic respiration, could extract far more energy from food than anaerobic processing. A glucose molecule metabolized anaerobically might yield 2 ATP. The same molecule metabolized aerobically yields about 30 ATP. This energy surplus enabled new possibilities, new levels of complexity, eventually enabling the evolution of large multicellular organisms with high energy demand. Archaea also diversified, though we know less about their history because they're less well studied than bacteria, and because they're less common in most environments, or at least less conspicuous. Archaea specialized in extreme environments, in conditions that other organisms found inhospitable: hot springs, salt lakes, acidic pools, methane-producing anaerobic environments. But archaea also live in normal environments, in soil and ocean, and they play important roles in nutrient cycling, particularly nitrogen cycling. The archaeal lineage also gave rise, directly or indirectly, to eukaryotes, though the exact mechanism remains debated. The leading hypothesis is that a eukaryote arose from a fusion between an archaeal cell and a bacterial cell, with the bacterium becoming the mitochondrion and the archaeon becoming the host cell containing the nucleus. This endosymbiotic theory, championed by Lynn Margulis in the 1960s and 1970s, was controversial initially, but is now widely accepted, supported by extensive genetic and molecular evidence. The origin of eukaryotes was a second pivot point in life's history, comparable in importance to LUCA itself. Eukaryotes would eventually give rise to all complex multicellular life: plants, animals, fungi, transforming Earth's ecosystem, creating forests and coral reefs and grassland, filling the planet with visible, macroscopic organisms. But this took time. For about 2 billion years after LUCA, life remained mostly microscopic, mostly single-celled. Bacteria and archaea diversified, filled the oceans, colonized terrestrial environment, transformed the atmosphere and the chemistry of rocks and water, but remained small, simple, invisible to the naked eye. The first eukaryotes appeared perhaps 2 billion years ago, maybe earlier, as single-celled organisms not dramatically different in size or lifestyle from bacteria, but eukaryotes had potential, had the internal complexity that would eventually allow dramatic increases in size and sophistication. They had nuclei to protect and organize their genetic material, mitochondria to power their metabolism, internal membranes to compartmentalize different functions, cytoskeletons to maintain shape and enable movement. For another billion years or more, eukaryotes remained mostly single-celled, diversifying into the various protist groups we see today: amoebas, ciliates, flagellates, algae. But then, about 800 million to 1 billion years ago, something remarkable happened. Some eukaryotes became multicellular. Multicellularity evolved independently many times in animals, plants, fungi, various algae, even some bacteria. It's not particularly difficult in evolutionary terms. Cells just need to stick together after division instead of separating, and cooperate instead of competing. But multicellularity enabled new possibilities, new levels of organization, new capabilities. Multicellular organisms can be large, can occupy space in ways single cells cannot. They can differentiate, with different cells specializing for different functions, some for acquiring nutrients, some for reproduction, some for structure, some for sensing the environment. This specialization allows efficiency, allows each cell type to become very good at its particular function. In animals, this specialization led to tissues and organs, to nervous systems that could process information, to digestive systems that could efficiently extract nutrients, to circulatory systems that could transport materials around large bodies, to skeletons that could provide support and protection. The Cambrian explosion, about 540 million years ago, saw the rapid diversification of animals, the appearance of most major body plants, the development of predators and prey, of complex ecosystems with intricate food webs. In plants, specialization led to roots for absorbing water and nutrient, to stems for support and transport, to leaves for photosynthesis, to flowers for reproduction. Plants colonized land about 450 million years ago, transforming terrestrial environment, creating soil, providing food and habitat for animals that would follow them onto land. In fungi, specialization led to hyphae that could penetrate substrates, to fruiting bodies for dispersing spores, to complex relationships with plants, mycorrhizae that help plants absorb nutrients, lichens that combine fungi with photosynthetic partners. All of this complexity, all of this diversity, traces back through eukaryotes to LUCA. The mitochondria in your cells are descendants of bacteria that lived before eukaryotes existed, bacteria that might have been contemporaries of early post-LUCA organisms. The ribosomes in your cells are modified descendants of LUCA's ribosome. The genetic code you use is LUCA's code, with only minor variation. You are, in a very real sense, ancient. Not as an individual, you're young, only a few decades old at most, but as a lineage, as a participant in a process that has been ongoing for billions of years. The information in your genome is ancient, copied from your parents, who copied it from their parent, in an unbroken chain back to LUCA and beyond. Some of your genes are very old, nearly unchanged from the versions that existed in LUCA. Genes for ribosomal protein, for basic metabolic enzyme, for DNA replication machinery. These are conserved because they perform essential function, because any significant change would be fatal. These genes are molecular fossils, preserved not in rock, but in every living cell, testament to the deep unity of life. Other genes are younger, innovations that arose after LUCA, after the domains diverged, after eukaryotes appeared, after animals evolved. Genes for specialized tissues, for immune system, for complex developmental program. These are more recent, though still often hundreds of millions of years old. They're elaborations on older themes, modifications of existing genes, adaptations to new challenges. And some of your genes are very recent, unique to humans or to primates, arising in the last few million years through duplication and modification of older genes. Genes involved in brain development, in language, in uniquely human capabilities. These are the newest addition, the most recent chapters in the long story of genetic evolution, stretching back to LUCA. This layered quality of genome, with genes of different ages, stacked like geological strata, reflects the incremental nature of evolution. New features are built on old foundations, modifying and elaborating existing existing structures rather than creating entirely new ones from scratch. This is why comparative anatomy reveals homology, similarities that reflect common ancestry. The bones in your hand are arranged similarly to the bones in a bat's wing, in a whale's flipper, in a horse's leg, because all are modifications of the same ancestral mammalian limb. Evolution is a tinkerer, as Francois Jacob famously said, not an engineer. It works with what's available, modifying existing structures to serve new functions, rather than designing optimal solutions from first principles. This leads to quirks, to features that seem poorly designed but make sense in light of evolutionary history. Your eyes have a blind spot where the optic nerve passes through the retina, because vertebrate eyes developed with the nerve in front of the light-sensitive cells, a constraint inherited from early vertebrate ancestors. Octopus eyes don't have this blind spot because they evolved independently with a different structure. Neither design is better in absolute terms, but each reflects different historical pathways, different evolutionary solutions. Your laryngeal nerve, which controls your voice box, loops down around your aorta before returning to the larynx, a circuitous route that makes sense only in light of evolutionary history. In fish, the ancestor of this nerve runs straight from brain to gill. In mammals, as the neck lengthened and the heart descended into the chest during evolution, the nerve kept its original path relative to the blood vessel, even though a direct path would be more efficient. In giraffes, this nerve runs several meters down the neck and back up, an absurd detour that no engineer would design, but that evolution produces through gradual modification of ancestral structure. These quirks, these imperfections, are some of the strongest evidence for evolution. They make no sense as design, but perfect sense as products of history, as modifications of inherited structures constrained by what came before. They show that we're not created fresh, but descended from earlier form, carrying forward the features and constraints of our ancestors. LUCA, too, probably had quirks, features that were not optimal, but that worked well enough, that were inherited by descendants, because replacing them would be too disruptive. The particular arrangement of the genetic code, the specific lipids used in membranes, the details of ribosome structure, these might not be the best possible solutions, but they're the solutions that arose in early life and then became frozen, locked in place by the dependence of everything else on them. This historical contingency, this dependence of the present on the past, means that evolution is not repeatable in detail. If we could rewind the tape of life and play it again, as Stephen Jay Gould suggested, we'd likely get very different results. Different mutations would occur, different lineages would survive, different innovations would arise. Earth might have complex life, but that life would probably look very different from what actually evolved. Different body plans, different organ systems, maybe even different biochemistry. But in broad strokes, evolution might be somewhat repeatable. Life would probably still be cellular, still use some form of genetic information storage, still have metabolism and reproduction. These are fundamental features, probably inevitable, given the constraints of chemistry and physics. And evolution would probably still produce complexity, still generate diversity, still fill available niches with adapted organisms. The specifics would differ, but the patterns might be similar. This is what convergent evolution suggests, that similar problems tend to elicit similar solutions, even from different starting points. Eyes, wings, shells, photosynthesis. These have evolved multiple times, suggesting that they're good solutions to common challenges, solutions that evolution tends to discover given appropriate selective pressures. LUCA, in this light, might have been somewhat inevitable, not in specific details, the exact genes, the precise metabolism, the particular structures, but in general features. Life needs genetic information, storage, needs metabolism, needs membranes, needs reproduction. LUCA had solutions to these needs, solutions that worked well enough to persist for billions of years. Different solutions might have worked too, but LUCA's solutions were successful, were inherited by all descendants, became the foundation for all subsequent evolution. Let's think about what LUCA means for the search for life beyond Earth. If life arose on Earth, could it arise elsewhere? Are there other LUCAs on other planets, other trees of life with different roots, different histories, different outcomes? The answer depends on how difficult it is for life to originate, how many conditions must be satisfied, how lucky Earth was. If life arose quickly on Earth, as soon as conditions were favorable. That suggests it's relatively easy, that the transition from chemistry to biology is probable given liquid water, appropriate chemicals, and energy sources. In that case, life might be common in the universe, arising on many worlds with Earth-like conditions. But if Earth was unusually lucky, if the origin of life required a specific rare combination of circumstances, then life might be rare, confined to a small fraction of planets, even among those with liquid water and organic chemistry. We don't know which scenario is correct. We have a sample size of 1, Earth, which is insufficient to determine probabilities. The discovery of life elsewhere would dramatically improve our understanding. If we found even simple life on Mars, or on Europa, or on Enceladus, moons of Jupiter and Saturn with subsurface oceans, we could compare it to Earth life, see whether it uses the same biochemistry or different solutions, determine whether it shares an origin with Earth life or arose independently. If extraterrestrial life uses DNA, the same genetic code, the same amino acids, that would suggest either that these features are universal, inevitable for any life, or that life spread between Earth and Mars or other bodies through exchange of meteorite. But if extraterrestrial life uses different information storage molecules, different amino acids, different energy currency, that would prove that life can arise independently, that there are multiple solutions to the challenges of building living systems. An extraterrestrial LUCA, a last common ancestor of Martian life or European life, would be fascinating to compare with our LUCA. Did they face similar challenges, develop similar solutions, evolve in similar environments? Or are there fundamentally different ways to build living systems, different metabolism, different structures, different evolutionary strategy? These questions remain speculative for now. We haven't found life elsewhere, haven't even confirmed that it exists, but the search continues, with missions to Mars looking for fossils or extant life, with plans to explore the subsurface ocean of icy moon, with telescopes searching for biosignatures in the atmospheres of exoplanets orbiting other stars. If life is common, if many planets host their own LUCA and their own trees of life, then the universe is full of diversity, full of different experiments in biology, full of worlds where evolution has produced outcomes we can barely imagine. Some might have complex life, even intelligent life, civilizations that have been evolving for billions of years longer than ours, or for much shorter time, or that have taken entirely different paths. But even if life is rare, even if Earth is one of few inhabited worlds in our galaxy or beyond, LUCA remains profoundly important. LUCA is our connection to the origin of life, our link to the deep path, the ancestor we share with every organism on our planet. LUCA is evidence that life can arise from chemistry, that complexity can emerge from simplicity, that evolution can produce the extraordinary diversity we see around us. As we move toward the conclusion of this journey, let's reflect on what we've learned, on what LUCA tells us about life, about ourselves, about our place in the cosmos. LUCA lived approximately 3.5 to 4 billion years ago, in a world radically different from ours, a world of hot oceans and volcanic activity, of chemical energy flowing from hydrothermal vents, of an atmosphere without oxygen. LUCA was small, simple by modern standards, a single-celled organism with perhaps 1,000 genes, with basic metabolism extracting energy from inorganic chemicals, with membranes and ribosomes and DNA. From LUCA, all modern life descended. The tree of life split early into 3 great branches: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, each exploring different evolutionary possibilities, each generating vast diversity. Bacteria developed metabolisms to exploit every chemical gradient, every energy source, transforming Earth's chemistry. Archaea specialized in extreme environment, pioneered unique metabolism. Eukaryotes developed internal complexity, eventually becoming multicellular, evolving into all the visible life we see, plants and animals and fungi. Throughout this diversification, throughout billions of years of evolution, certain features remained conserved, inherited from LUCA, essential to all life. The genetic code, the structure of ribosomes, the use of ATP, the basic mechanisms of DNA replication and protein synthesis. These molecular fossils testify to our common ancestry, to the unity underlying life's diversity. We carry LUCA's legacy in every cell. The ribosomes reading genetic information in your cells right now are modified versions of LUCA's ribosome. The genetic code specifying your proteins is LUCA's code. The ATP powering your metabolism is LUCA's energy currency. You are, quite literally, a descendant of LUCA, billions of generations removed, but connected by an unbroken chain of inheritance. This connection has implications. It means you're related to every living thing, that all organisms are family, that the boundaries we draw between humans and other life are matters of degree, not kind. It means we're not separate from nature, but part of it. Participants in an ancient process, beneficiaries of billions of years of evolutionary innovation. It means we have responsibility. If all life is family, if we share common ancestry with every organism, then our treatment of other life matters morally, not just practically. The extinction of species, the destruction of ecosystems, the disruption of the biosphere, these aren't just unfortunate, but wrong, violations of our kinship with other living things. This doesn't mean we can't use other organisms, can't eat plants or animals, can't modify environments to suit our needs. Every organism affects its environment, competes with other species, uses resources. That's part of being alive. But it does mean we should be mindful, should recognize that we're not owners of the earth, but participants in its ecosystem, that our actions have consequences for other life, for the biosphere as a whole, ultimately for ourselves. The story of LUCA is also a story of resilience, of survival against odds. Life has persisted for nearly 4 billion years through catastrophes that would seem unsurvivable, through asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions and climate swings and mass extinction. Life found a way, adapted, diversified, filled empty niches, recovered from disasters. This resilience comes not from individual organisms, which are fragile and mortal, but from the process of evolution, the generation of variation and its testing through selection. As long as some organisms survive, as long as genetic information can be passed forward, life can recover, can adapt, can persist. But this resilience has limit. Severe enough disruption, rapid enough changes, extensive enough destruction could overwhelm life's ability to adapt. The end Permian extinction came close to ending complex life entirely. A large enough asteroid, a severe enough volcanic episode, or perhaps human-caused disruption, climate change, habitat destruction, pollution, could potentially trigger a comparable catastrophe. We live in a moment of crisis, a time when human activities are causing extinctions at rates comparable to past mass extinction, when we're changing the climate faster than at any time in millions of years, when we're fundamentally altering ecosystems globally. This is dangerous, not just for the species going extinct, but potentially for the whole biosphere, including ourselves. The perspective of deep time, of evolutionary history, shows us that life will probably persist, that some organisms will adapt to whatever changes we cause, that evolution will continue. But it also shows us that individual lineages, individual species are vulnerable, that we're not exempt from extinction, that civilizations can fall. The choice before us is whether we'll recognize our place in nature, our kinship with all life, our dependence on functioning ecosystems, and act accordingly, or whether we'll continue heedless, assuming we're separate from nature, that we can exploit resources without consequence, that technology will solve all problems. LUCA can't tell us what to do, can't provide moral guidance directly, but LUCA can remind us of who we are, where we came from, how we're connected to everything else, and perhaps that awareness, that sense of connection and kinship can inform our choices, can inspire us to be better stewards, more thoughtful inhabitants of this planet we share with millions of other species, all our relatives, all descended from the same ancient ancestor. As we reach the end of this journey, as we prepare to return from deep time to the present, let's take a moment to appreciate the enormity of what we've explored. We've traveled back 3.5 to 4 billion years to a time when Earth was young and alien, when life was beginning its long experiment, when LUCA lived in warm water, metabolizing chemicals, replicating DNA, passing on genetic information that would flow forward through billions of generations to every organism alive today. We've traced the tree of life from its root in LUCA through its branching into 3 domains, through the origin of eukaryotes and the evolution of complex multicellular life, through the appearance of plants and animals and fungi, through the long history that eventually led to us, to humans, to consciousness and language, and the ability to look back and understand our own origin. We've seen that we're not separate creations, but products of evolution, descendants of LUCA, carriers of molecular fossils that testify to our ancient heritage. We've seen that we're related to every living thing, that all life is family, that the unity underlying diversity is real and profound and discoverable through science, And we've reflected on what this means, how it should shape our thinking about ourselves, about other life, about our responsibilities as conscious beings capable of understanding our place in nature and choosing how we'll act. The story of LUCA is ultimately a story about connection, about continuity across vast time, about the thread of genetic information that links all life together. It's a story that can inspire wonder and humility and reverence for life in all its forms. As you go about your day, as you eat food and breathe air and interact with other organisms, remember that you're participating in processes that began with LUCA, that have been ongoing for billions of years, that connect you to the deep past and to every living thing. Remember that the cells in your body are performing the same basic functions that LUCA's cell performed: metabolizing, synthesizing protein, replicating DNA, using molecular machines inherited from that ancient ancestor and refined by billions of years of evolution. Remember that you're part of something larger than yourself, larger than humanity, larger than any single species or ecosystem. You're part of the tree of life, part of the grand experiment that began billions of years ago in warm water on a young planet, part of the ongoing story of evolution that continues in every forest and field and ocean, in every living cell, in every moment of every day. And perhaps with that awareness, with that sense of connection to all life, with that understanding of our deep ancestry in LUCA, we can find wisdom, can make better choices, can be worthy descendants of the ancient organism that made everything else possible. LUCA lived, LUCA reproduced, LUCA's genetic information flowed forward through time, to you, to me, to every organism alive today. We are LUCA's legacy, LUCA's continuation, LUCA's distant descendants, carrying forward the experiment that began so long ago. And now, billions of years after LUCA, we have the extraordinary privilege and responsibility of understanding our own origin, of recognizing our kinship with all life, of choosing what kind of ancestors we'll be for the generations that follow us, for the life that will continue long after we're gone, for the tree of life that will keep growing, keep branching, keep exploring the possibilities of existence on this beautiful, ancient, living planet we call home. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for traveling back through deep time to meet LUCA, for contemplating the profound connections that link us to every living thing. May this knowledge bring you wonder, humility, and a sense of responsibility to care for the family of life we all belong to, the family that traces back, unbroken, to that single cell in warm water billions of years ago. LUCA, our universal ancestor, the source of everything living. Rest well, knowing you carry within you the legacy of billions of years, the inheritance of countless ancestors, the gift of life that began with LUCA and